Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Richard, for the invitation. We had a bit of a conversation about what it would be most interesting for your department, for your institute for me to share. And we kind of realized that anything, like all the issues around environment and I think Richard thought my research on education was interesting as well. So I thought I would give you sort of a little bit of a 3 different projects that I had done in the last 10, 15 years that are dealing with human-environment relations in the context of technology development, technologies that are used and that are often quite contested or controversial. So maybe I can show you on the next slide a little overview of what I will be talking about today. So I'll be talking, because Richard was really interested in this a project. This was my doctoral research back in 2012-13 when I did my PhD in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia. And this is my research on bringing together sort of like contrasting Hawaiian land relations and indigenous epistemologies with agricultural biotechnology, which was at the time was very dominant. And then I'll give you a little insight of a project on indoor vertical farming, which I did after my PhD in Munich. And the sort of ideas of optimizing nature or the environment indoors, so in this very controlled environments. And then I'll briefly talk about a more recent project where I've sort of come to think more about what, you know, technologies and innovation are not always contrary to environmental relationships, but rather mediate these relationships, and what are developments, what are technologies that should be developed for nature-based solutions and nature-based farming. Okay, next slide. So just a brief overview. This was like I said, a doctoral research project with a terribly long title. I always tell my students, choose a very short title. You'll never remember, and it's too much to fill out in all these forms. But basically what it was a research study that had built on a master's research that I did from a master's degree before on Hawaiian charter schools. So Hawaiian schools that are public, but also so semi-public, where they have a very strong focus on teaching indigenous and Hawaiian ways of knowing, epistemologies, worldviews, and also the relationship to the land. And in this time, the biotech industry had become very prominent and growing. So this is in the 2010s. And you can see here on the screen where there used to be sugarcane fields in this light green areas, and then the dark green where the seed companies, so Syngenta, BASF, Monsanto, though they were not on this island, were quite present to be taking over these fields that had been sugar plantations before. And in the time when I was there was a growing anti-GMO movement. And so as I was, what I was discerning throughout my ethnographic research was there were very different understandings of what it means to be educated on GMOs and educated on land. So what were these knowledge claims that people were articulating through this form of education? And I was contrasting or comparing this at the Hawaiian Charter School, at the anti-GMO movement, and at the biotech industry. Next slide. So there's a longer history that I won't be able to go too much into, but in Hawaii, testing and trying out and researching new genetically engineered crops is particularly papaya, but then also taro or kalo, which in Hawaii is a very sacred plant. I already also wrote a paper on this if you're more interested in this controversy of genetically engineering a plant that Hawaiians considered to be their elder brother and their ancestor. So where these cultural frictions come full force with these scientific ideas of rationality, and we're doing this only for the betterment of this plant. And then the increasing presence of Monsanto in particular on Oahu that has already sort of created this atmosphere of tense atmosphere at the time when I came there in 2012. Next slide. So this is one field that you see on Kauai. So these used to be sugarcane plantations in the past, and then before that taro fields, and now they mostly grow genetically engineered and now gene-edited crops like corn, to then create new seeds that are then transferred, planted, and distributed around the world, because Hawaii has a very conducive climate. You can grow year-round. And next slide. I think this is the next slide. When I was there, it was kind of, I guess I was lucky at the time. It was kind of really heated because there was a bill that was introduced to actually disclose the kinds of pesticides that are used to create buffer zones, because a lot of these fields are right next to schools or villages where people live. And then also, and that was very bold, to have a moratorium on these genetically engineered crops, which across the United States is already legally regulated, that it's not that it is substantially equivalent to regular crops. What these hearings that were going over half a year revealed was that Hawaii was actually a place where there were more restricted use pesticides applied than anywhere else in the United States, that the Department of Health and Agriculture were severely understaffed, and there was actually no tests basically check-ins of these levels done, and that the medical doctors were observing these very abnormal rates of cancer and asthma, particularly on the west side of the island. And so throughout these, the bill hearings, there were very different ideas or understanding, like claims of who is actually right about whether this is safe or whether this is not safe, whether this is good for the land or not. Next slide. And I started to then realize that there is this very separate I guess very dichotomous narrative that we know from other fields, where you have the people that are against GMOs, and they're irrational and they're emotional and they cannot understand the topic. And then on the other side are those who understand the topic, the scientists themselves, that are claiming basically, sorry, missing the word, that are corroborating basically that this is safe. As you know, genetically engineered crops are quite controversial. There are different regulations around the world, and the United States is very lenient in this regard. And what I found more and more is that there's these ideas of what it means to be educated about this were quite different. So here is an excerpt from a brochure from Hawaii Crop Improvement Association, which is supporting this industry, where there was a farmer that was quoted that the scientists actually need to do more to educate consumers and to ease the skepticism. And this was quite contrary to other forms of education that I found. Next slide. So here is a quote from an anti-GMO activist who was actually really getting aggravated about this constant discourse of coming together and getting educated, and actually says that she feels like this call for more education is a way of deferring that there is actually something really fishy about the ways that the industry works, and that it's very lax and lenient. And that it's sort of just a cover-up. Next slide. And then this is a quote from another activist who was Native Hawaiian and who was using a term that came up again and again, which is the na'au. So he says, upon my discovery of the possibilities of harmful effects of GMO on the Aina, which is the land, my heart hurt, and my na'au told me that this was not right. And I was starting to get really interested in what kinds of terminologies were used to justify what kinds of claims. Next slide. And so I dug a little bit deeper into this, what's actually the etymological root of education. And Tim Ingold, which an anthropology whom you probably know, wrote this piece on education, and actually brought me to realize that the root of education, educere, means to lead out and to go out into the world and to kind of like exploring, rather than this idea that we have nowadays of like instilling knowledge into our minds, kind of like you just put the data or like the raw data into people's minds. It's something that you have very common also in ideas of science communication. You just need the very raw data and factual information, and then people will get it. And this is somewhat different to the na'au, which is actually the root for na'au, which is education. And the na'au is a small intestine, or what we would probably call the gut feeling, that is also the seat of emotion, of thought, and intellect. So it's not a separate mode where you have the mind that is rational and the heart is emotional. It's the na'au, the gut feeling, that are actually bringing this together. So there's a very different epistemological tradition or understanding of how humans know, and it's not bodily separated as in the Western discourse. So I was starting to think, okay, what is it? It seems it's not education itself; it's an institution more when we talk about education. But it's this feeling of being educated, the educatedness. So beyond institution-biased ideas of education. It's an epistemic articulation that points to these issues that people express when they say, we need to get educated, or we need to educate the public. So education, similar to science and in STS, in science and technology studies, is actually something that is not outside of these social and political and legal dimensions, but it's very much tied to these ideas. So what is your idea of scientific robust is also shaping what is your idea of being educated. And when your idea of being educated means that you have a good, caring land relationship, then that will change as a result as well. Next slide. So then I summed this up as the biotech corporations, they were, when they talked about being educated or educating the public, was very much versus an emotional talk, a very scientific, sound idea, and also as a corrective effort for these public misconceptions of biotechnology. In the movement, it was more seen as a democratic right, also on a scientific base, but understanding GMOs from a scientific perspective that is probably more as critical as the one in the European Union. There were often references made to this legal system. And then also being educated means to understand how the political system is entangled with the industry and how they're favored over others. And for the Kanaka Maoli, the Native Hawaiians in the movement, it was also a claim of a different bodily location of knowing, which is in the na'au, and a very strong relationship to the aina, that it's not used but that it's cared for. And in the school there was a very strong sense of a self-determination of teaching Hawaiian values. And then also the students, which I'm not talking too much today about, but their forms, what I call their learnscapes, that they are also navigating this very settler colonial and highly touristic terrain that is Hawaii. and these adult expectations to become these future ambassadors, cultural ambassadors, because a lot of these previous generations were not knowledgeable about these relationships to land that they learn in the school. Next slide. So to sum up this project, what I would like to give to pass on, I guess, is that to think about how we claim to know. So in my case, how people claim to be educated, to know the environment is never neutral, but it's deeply entangled with deontology. So what we consider to be the environment, is it the aina, or is it something, is it a ground for testing and researching novel genetically engineered crops? Or is it a paradise for a lot of anti-GMO activists that were actually from the US and they had resettled in Hawaii, so the settler colonial dimension? Or is it an ancestor? Okay, next slide. So I'm going to just jump to the next project, and I think we maybe can do Q&A afterwards, unless there is a very burning, clarifying question. I'll jump to a totally different project. This brought me, I was brought to this project when I came from Vancouver to Munich. And we were actually approached by the Technical University as social scientists, to do a quote citizen participation forum on vertical farming with an industry partner from the Netherlands, so vertical farming company, and a food science communication consultancy in Brussels. And this was a very different project. So it was a transdisciplinary project where we were directly working with the industry, and we were tasked to find out, and this I just see that this is not on the slide. This was in 2017-18. So this was at a time, I'm not.
I think you are muted, Mascha.
Hello.
Okay,
Sorry.
now it's better.
I don't know what happened. Mysterious things are happening today on my.
Technology has its own life. We know.
Yes.
We all know that. Independent of human beings.
So yeah, so we were we organized a lot of different public events at different museums in Munich and in London. We did a research project on social media hashtagging of vertical farming, which you'll see the paper here. I'm not going to talk too much about this today. What I was interested in throughout this project was not so much, how do you communicate vertical farming better, but how do people, advocates of vertical farming, of indoor vertical farming, consider or conceive of nature and improving these plants through these indoor controlled settings, and through this also how they're shaping these relationships between plants and humans. Next slide. So what is vertical farming or indoor vertical farming? Often these terms are used interchangeably. There is a lot of media attention nowadays, not so much. Nowadays it pops up, it's like, oh, there's another huge vertical farm company that is bankrupt. That's usually the news I see. But the people that have been advocating for vertical farming see a lot of advantages, because you can basically set up a growth system within existing buildings, or you create a new factory, and you can basically control year-round production, because you're completely independent from outside climates and humidity, etc. There is a very low use of pesticides as fertilizers. It's much less water used. It's not such a long haul to transport food, because it can be close to the city. It has higher food and security standards, etc. And then the critiques have also not died since back then, that it's an immense investment that is needed, particularly from venture capital investors. So they're looking for so-called unicorns, companies that have a big promise of return of investment. They are given millions and millions of dollars for several years until they have to basically be able to operate independently, which in many cases does actually not work. So I just heard that Plenty, which is a big one in California, just declared that they're insolvent or bankrupt. So and another big critique is that it's extremely inefficient in terms of energy. So the idea that you're basically controlling a whole system and you're also blacking out the sun, so you're creating new artificial light settings, creates more need for energy. The economic viability is not given, as I just said. There's often issues with labor inequality and also social justice issues that these companies are often feeding at the end. They are claiming that they're making food cheaper, so most of the stuff that they are growing is lettuce and greens that are very easily perishable and can be harvested quickly, so herbs and stuff. And then they're claiming to feed the world with this, but they end up often selling this stuff to very rich, very expensive restaurants, so luxury restaurants. Next slide. And so what I did in another publication is I was really interested in better understanding these visions that these proponents of vertical farming have, because there is very little material substantive that they can rely on, because these most of these firms just basically die out again. And there was and there's a concept that I used from Stephen Hillgartner, who is at Cornell, and he thinks about, he's interested in how vanguards, so these self-proclaimed entrepreneurs, politicians, they can be very heterogeneous kind of elite group that are envisioning a certain future where a certain scientific approach or technology is going to alleviate certain problems, or in this case, the agricultural system that is malfunctioning. So we need to go indoors in order to grow food more efficiently. And I was applying this to vertical farming because I found that there was also vanguard visions are not necessarily so well established as socio-technical imaginaries. This is another term in science and technology studies, which has much more robustness and is much more widely shared. So a socio-technical imaginary is that we will all in the future have laptops and cell phones, and we will absolutely not be able to work without them. And in the case of indoor vertical farming, it's not so widely shared or accepted as this is the future of food production. And so I described this vanguard vision of vertical farming as this borrowing these concepts and popular scripts, cultural scripts of containment. So we're containing something. This was very, that experienced another boost in the pandemic, where you see here also a picture of this restaurant. Like you still see this actually. People are sitting in little greenhouses when they eat their food. And the idea of cleanliness, of hygienic cleanliness, the ability to feed the world, and then this land sparing narrative. So we just basically we can produce food in very concentrated, spatially closed areas in order to spare other land to be environmentally protected. This is the land sparing narrative. And so there is this idea that vertical farming is this very aesthetically slick, automated, indoor controlled urban food production. And I'll talk a little bit about this in the next slides. So you can go to the next. Yeah, so part of this idea is that the human is actually not an actor in these food production systems, but it's a disturbance in the process of growing the food, growing these plants. So this is a quote from a startup owner in San Francisco, and he was basically showing like, well, we need algorithms, we need artificial intelligence, we need surveillance cameras. Basically, we need to remove the human eye and hands, or at least drastically reduce them, to have this much cleaner setup where we basically don't need the human anymore. So, and this resonates with this idea of Despommier. Dixon Despommier is an emeritus professor at Columbia Universities who very much popularized vertical farming back in the 2010s. And he actually envisioned this sort of barrier medicine approach, like coming from the Ebola virus lab work, where you have a high security situation where you basically, I mean, you see it in the image too, humans are becoming more like lab workers growing food. Next slide. So this, you know, obviously as an environmental anthropologist, I was like, wow, this is fascinating. How you know, nature or plants are conceived or conceptualized as these like very, very individualistic plants that are grown in actually very monocultural systems. And these are some quotes from a vertical farm owner, and they're basically, they're sort of rendering earth or nature as is inefficient. They're not, nature is good, but too much nature is killing. I mean, that was really the wording that I find and that I found. And so LEDs in particular, this which have extremely developed in the last years and have already entered all our homes and offices, that have been optimized to also become to create the optimal growth condition for plants. So I'll talk a little bit about this in the next slide. And so if I were to click through this, it would look a bit better, but we have to do with this. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so when, I don't know if you've ever been in such a growth system, but when you actually go into such controlled systems, or growth chambers is what they're often called, the optimal growth is often, excuse me, or at the time at least, it was considered to be purple light, because the plant, for the photosynthesis and increased biomass production, really likes it's sort of the opposite lighting, which is purple to green. This was how it was explained to us. But the problem is that you can't really diagnose any diseases or anything that is happening, because everything is brown. So that is a bit of a barrier. Next slide. And so I was thinking like about this light as kind of also a disconnector from the species. So in some ways it connects to the plant, because it can, in their idea, optimize their plant growth. But it also has hormonal effects on other organisms. So for the human and the insects, bumblebees are often used as pollinators. They're not necessarily, those are not necessarily the conditions that are good for us. So when I was in a room like this, I felt extremely dizzy. The temperature is different, the humidity is different, the CO2 levels are different, the lighting is different. And so when I went out, all of a sudden, everything was green. So it was an interesting moment, because obviously my eye had to adjust, and I was like, oh, it's almost like the opposite of what the plant sees, but who's actually defining what this optimal condition is for the plant? That kind of got me thinking. Next slide. Yeah, so I'll go a bit quicker through this, but what I found interesting was that it was not necessarily the optimal growth condition, was not always the photosynthesis. So the creation of more biomasses to create plants to grow food, so like lettuce. For researchers, it was actually to experiment and tinker with these LED technologies. And to work, so sorry, not for the researchers, for the tech developers. I don't know what I just said. So those that are actually developing these LEDs, they develop different LED systems for those who create for production than for those who research these plants. Because for the researchers, it's more interesting to tinker and think about other growth phases of the plant than just the photosynthesis and the biomass production. How does a plant actually, what are these other phases? And so LED can actually, and tinkering and twisting with these light, whether it's a bit more white or whether it's more purple or pink, can actually create more knowledge. So this is the quote here on the left at the bottom. We can actually understand and increase our scientific knowledge of plants. And at the same time, for the LED developer, they're also making more production because they create more LEDs for this kind of knowledge production. So it's not a mere thing of like, oh, here we have LEDs and we could create just increasing more research. It's a mutual relationship between research and industry. The more LED technologies that are developed, the more we find out about plants, and this in turn spurs the technology development. Next slide. I think we can actually skip this one, yes, because this is what I've already said. So next slide. So because of this mutual relationship, so not to think of here is environment plant on the one hand and here is the technology on the other, and the human is sort of like outside of it. I was reminded of Donna Haraway's nature culture concept. So her claim basically that organisms and technology, so humans and technology, are never separated, but they are always co-constructing, and they're indistinguishable. So we are actually in the case of vertical farming, I think you can see this very nicely, that these LED systems are actually creating more scientific research, but they're also creating new human-plant relationships through these technologies. Next slide. So, so my kind of, I haven't published this, but my preliminary conclusion for this is that it's an interesting nature-culture constellation where it both connects and disconnects species. So in the connecting species situation, you have this idea that there is this one single contact in these automated systems when humans are sort of considered to be nuisance and they should be outside. It's the moment when you're consuming the food. This is the only sort of contact between these two species, between plants and humans, when they're consumed. And also in plant science, where, as I just said, more scientific knowledge is generated in these very laboratory settings. And then it's also disconnecting species, again, because humans are considered a potential vector for bacteria in these very highly sterile systems. And then also the question of this optimal growth condition, for whom? For the plant, is it an optimal growth condition? If that might be suboptimal for the human, as I said before, we are sensing air very differently and very much more irritated through our eyes and skins and our hormonal system. And then this idea, like this connects to this vanguard vision I was talking about before, that there's this biohazard lab aesthetic, and you see this also nowadays in so modern kitchen aesthetic that is very sleek and clean and very white, and surfaces that are, there's basically nothing that disturbs this idea of purity, and this reflects this biopolitics, where we're basically getting rid of any other kinds of organisms, like and in this case, overly cleansing and very hygienic idea that this is the proper place to grow, to grow, but also to make food. Next slide. So at the end, it is a question of, might not be too surprising, but an example of how species dominate other species. So humans who are defining the optimal growth condition for plants, and what is the goal of that is to reach increased productivity, and whether that is more biomass, nutrition, flavor for vertical farm companies that are creating for the market, for people to buy their products, but also so it's in this realm, but also in research that increases more scientific knowledge and more technology developed. So it's in deeply capitalistic system that is sort of packaged as humane, I guess you could say, an endeavor to feed the world and grow more food in this very secure setting. Next slide. So this is now the third project. I don't know how much time I have. I'm aware that we lost some time with the technical glitches. If I speak for another 10 minutes, is that okay? Or
yes, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so now I want to share with you a very different project again, which actually grew out of a research project, a multi-sided research project on sustainable agriculture. I was very interested in what sustainability means in making agriculture more sustainable in the European context. So I was interested in EU agriculture policy, the framing of sustainability, and what role science and technology, digitization increasingly, and innovation play in shaping this idea of a more sustainable agriculture in Europe. And in turn, how this imaginary in the policy also, like I said, how that actually shapes sustainable agriculture. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but part of this rather long project, it was a bit disrupted through the pandemic, and then it was prolonged until 2023. It ran from 2019 until 23. 2019. And so I went to Brussels a lot, and I went to conferences. I did a lot of expert interviews, not too ethnographic. There was one ethnographic project at a regenerative farm in Germany. And then we also did, the last part of this project was this participatory speculative design workshop that we called Digitization and Biodiverse Farming. And that's the project I would like to talk about next. Next slide. Yeah, so about 1.5 years ago, together with a colleague from Humboldt University, we developed we wanted to do a workshop with farmers, small-scale farmers that are interested in agroecological approaches in organic farming, and to think with us about the role of digital tools for the future of their farming, because digitization is often biased towards large-scale farming, and we wanted to challenge this a little bit. Next slide. So a little bit about the context. This is the kind of work that I'm interested in more in the last years. Like I said, it's very much this idea of digitization and agriculture 4.0, as it's often called, is very heavily framed by proponents of big data system and large-scale farming. So the big data corporations are increasingly merging with monocultural, the agricultural industry that is highly monocultural. So the kinds of tractors, so John Deere, that would be promoting these kinds of tools are increasingly merging with or collaborating with big data corporations. And so you see this also in these renderings, in these visual renderings. So this is an example from the EU and from Canada, where I did some research as well. And these again, these visions, these future visions of what is the future of agriculture, is like these two farmers are standing next to their fields and they're looking into the screen. while there's a drone, or the beautiful sun is coming up, and the sort of like the drone is almost like this God-given present that is now helping to make agriculture more sustainable. And this claim is repeatedly made. It's going to make it more sustainable. But what we find in this is that these tools are extremely unsuitable or expensive or absolutely irrelevant for small-scale farmers, or only partially interesting. And so we termed this biodiverse farmers, because these farmers are often contributing to biodiversity, but maybe not what's the word? Not in a direct way. Like they might not necessarily get like funding for this, but they have a deep care for farming as something that is driven by diversity. And so again, we are interested in whose future visions of agriculture are actually represented in policy, advertising, and media, and to really think about the future visions not as sort of an insignificant amaterial aspect, but that is actually really shaping in the present already the kind of agriculture, and you could do it in any kind of sector, that is going to come. And the kinds of technologies that are used and that are already biased towards a particular kind of farming are going to bring the kind of farming which is very highly monocultural. And so we wanted to break this up a little bit and be like, okay, this can't be such a black-white situation. What are actually the nuances? So what are the kinds of digital tools that could potentially be of interest, and what are innovations that might be technical, but they don't have to be for a smaller scale farming. Next slide. Yeah, and so our motivation for this project, for this workshop, was to look at farmers' initiatives. So you see here FarmOS, they are based in the US. They're related to farm hackers. So they actually take digital systems that are existing on the market, and they are tinkering with them, and they're hacking them for their own farming needs. There is something called Grassroots Innovation Assembly for Agroecology, GIA or GIAA. And those are farming initiatives around the world that are interested in creating their own tools. So they have their own workshops, they invite other farmers, and then they co-develop machinery and tools, hand-scale tools that are useful for their farming. Because that kind of market is very small, or even inexistent. Large digital ag-tech corporations are not necessarily interested in this kind of farming, because it's not, in their understanding, it's not a viable market. So we wanted to understand what are actually those visions of those small-scale biodiverse farmers, also to challenge again this sort of binary techno-fix idea versus total skepticism against technologies. And then also for us, it was the question as social scientists, how can we actually offer spaces and platforms for disseminating, but also eliciting and then also disseminating these kinds of visions, and what we can learn from them. Next slide. So a bit about the methodological approach of this workshop, speculative design. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this, not surprisingly, it comes out of design, but it has been quite influential and interesting for social scientists, in some ways also in the humanities, to think about the very material, the material implications of design. And rather than to think of design as something that here we have a problem and this design is the solution, it's more considered that the design is to ask further questions. So you have here a list of different differences between these two domains, and to think not so much in the service of industry, but in the service of society, or farmers in this case. Not so much to present how the world is, but how it could be, very speculative. and to kind of provoke discussions rather than to kind of like finish or provide one solution for issues. So we invited 12 participants from community-supported agriculture, small, medium-scale farmers. There was one researcher and also one activist. Next slide. And so we had I won't talk too much about how we selected these topics, but we had 4 groups that were talking about, they were focusing on administration. So, how do you actually administer and how do digital tools can help or what are issues? And then direct marketing, and then knowledge sharing. And now I see that there's only 3, and I don't know what the 4th one was. Sorry. So there were 4 groups, and we asked them what role should digitization play as a solution, or why should it be avoided if there are other solutions? And what innovations or solutions would change their agricultural work in 2035. So we really invited them to think about their own experiences and their farming context. Next slide. And I think that I have a few slides now showing some examples from these groups. This one was an interesting one. This was the administration group, and they were thinking about how to actually create a data pool. So we often talk about clouds, but they were thinking more of like a pool where it's not necessarily the case that farmers have. So if you're familiar with the European Union, or I guess in Romania it used to be, has been adapted to that. There's a lot of bureaucracy for farmers. If you work in this area, you will be familiar with this, and there's a lot of constant data that has to be submitted. And they were really annoyed by this often double or triple amount of work that has to be done that is often unnecessary. And they were thinking more as, here we as farmers, so on these 2 pedestals, you see these farmers, they are actually owning this data pool, and then the administrators or the state can apply for so-called fishing licenses, data fishing licenses. So it's the farmers, it's a move from the farmer's obligation to provide data to the state to the state's obligation to seek the data. And they were visualizing these data sets as pearls, which also I found like an interesting valuation of data. So the data is primarily collected for farmers' operations and only in a secondary step for the state administration. And so also for farmers to share this data. So what kind of farming methods do you use, or what are your, what's your yield when you do XYZ method, etc. Next slide. Yeah, and then we had one that was going a little bit into this direction of knowledge sharing. So sorry, one more back. I think it would.
Sorry, slow a bit.
Jumping.
Yes.
So they were thinking how actually to create a platform that would allow sharing knowledge among farmers. So to use the digital tools more as a knowledge sharing device, so internet and communication technologies, and to kind of cultivate a sort of data culture and documenting these practices in the long run, so kind of like an agro Wikipedia. And sorry, I think I hear maybe in my echo. One person was saying that they put it quite succinctly: what is not written down did not happen. So particularly in farm settings, in small scale or CSA farming, community supported agriculture, you often have farmers that are only here, or apprentices that are only here for a season and then they leave. So how do you, that kind of knowledge gets lost. And then also in terms of knowledge and education, and again, education became a topic again. in this institutional sense that in the universities, they're not learning about agroecological knowledge enough. Like it's still very, very much biased towards learning how to run a farm that is very large scale, that is monocultural, and that kind of knowledge is basically just not shared in this institutional setting. Next slide. Yeah, and then this last group, or the third group that I'm portraying now is one that was looking at how direct marketing can actually can be more effective if the digital communication and the analog communication or analog meeting is put together. So I don't know how it is in Romania. I would be interested to know, but it's been increasingly a move to do everything online. You have online platforms where you can order from different kinds of farms, and that in itself is a good move. Like smaller farms connect and collaborate together on platforms, and then customers can basically pick and choose what they want. But the downside of that is that they're actually not really meeting in person. They're not necessarily learning anything about the farming practices. And so one participant put it this way, that the message is that there are various digital and analog solutions, and that the analog one, so the meeting face-to-face, is never really gone. So you can't just say, okay, we have the online ordering system now and everything is nice and easy. It's something is lost. So they were thinking about a community center that is actually also funded and supported by local politicians to accommodate these analog meetings, and then to provide education for them about their farm systems. So they have farm tours to connect the selling of the product, the sales, with educating customers on how they're actually operating on their farms. Next slide. Yeah, so this is a paper that I'm currently writing, but this is some of the preliminary conclusions is that there's a lot of discussion now in the field in research about data sovereignty and who owns the data in farming, especially companies like John Deere, who are collecting a lot of farming data, and it's often unclear whether farmers actually have ownership. Is not necessarily in the European Union, but in the United States, this is often an issue. But it's also a question about the infrastructure. Sorry, the data pool in this context. So who owns the cloud? Who owns the place, the infrastructure where the data is collected? The question, who is actually obliged to provide what information? So the power relations between farmers and state over this bureaucratic, often double and triple sharing of data, and how that could be alleviated by also thinking about who actually owns that data and who has to ask for permission to get this data. Yeah, and this was something that often came up, that there was not necessarily this idea that, oh, here's the bad digital farming future, and here are we all analog, but actually to think this together. And it's a question of how we think this together. Again, who owns the data, who can define what happens with this information, and to what end is this digital and analog merging, to what end is it used? So like I said before, the customers that can be notified digitally or virtually, and then they come in person to learn about the farming practices. Yeah, so yeah, basically this is the last point that I already mentioned. And so this, I think I have this one more slide with a question. And that is something that I'm now more and more interested in, how thinking about when technologies and innovations, when they are based in grassroots organizations in farming, how they are actually shaping the environment or understandings of the environment, and also about biodiversity, which is increasingly becoming an issue, a sort of a buzzword in agriculture policy or in policy more generally. So when the technology is not coming from outside, like genetically engineered seeds, or vertical farm system it was set up by some engineers that have not the kind of farming experience and practices that you would find in agroecological approaches or in regenerative farming or organic farming. So how this, what then this relationship between human and environment, how is that shifting when these technologies are, when these are grassroots based or emancipatory, what their mediating role is doing in this context. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And we'll start the Q&A, and I will look online. And Stefan, you could also, you are muted. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Okay, thank you, Mascha. Really very interesting. You offered us an overview over 3 different yet very related projects. I will.
There is a frozen. Their internet connection is not always optimal, and yeah, now we lost them a bit.
Yeah, I just give the floor to whoever wants to ask questions from the room. Adrian? No. Okay, so apparently there's no question from the room. I do have, but first of all, an observation, and I will start with a slight critique. I would have personally liked to have a sort of in-depth analysis of one single project instead of 3 different projects, which are totally, I can see the relations between them. Having said that, I have, well, 2 questions basically. One regards the second project and your project, and I'm not sure if what you described is nature culture in Donna Haraway's understanding. What I saw there is a sort of attempt to separate nature from nature. I mean, in agriculture is mostly a very complex process in which you have humans and non-humans. And in the non-humans part, apart from cultivars, you have birds, you have insects, you have worms, you have fungi, who basically all these networks of non-humans make agriculture possible. In this context, when you have robots, so you still have human culture, but humans are kind of separated from cultivars, which never happened before in human history. That's my first observation. And second, I would be intrigued by how we define nature in this particular context, because as I said, I see a sort of detachment of cultivars from everything else that in more classical agriculture is possible. That's my first question. So I'll go for the first project with the next question. But please, if you want to elaborate this, I'm not even sure if it's a question, is more like some thoughts I had when you presented.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, to your first point, Yeah, so Richard and we talked about what I should be focusing on for the presentation, and he really liked the case about Hawaii. But I thought, because it's such a long time ago and I had done so many other projects in the meantime, I thought that I would combine the some different projects to highlight the diversity of how the environment gets conceptualized in different cases. And then regarding the nature culture, I mean, I think that your point is valid, right? Like, what is the kind of nature that we're talking about? And maybe I didn't make this more explicit, but there, the way that humans, in this case, proponents of vertical farming, how they conceive of nature is obviously not neutral. Like, we don't have a neutral conception of that. But they would still claim that they're in some ways doing something for nature out there by doing it in here. And how, so this is the kind of land sparing argument that is often made, right? Like, we're making something for industrial food, or we're making something for humans producing food in this very excluded space in order to save nature out there. But how that is actually done is never elaborated. It's a very cheap argument, I would say. But I think that for Haraway, I think the nature culture in it does, for me, it does work, because I'm not necessarily, I don't think that Haraway means that there is this one nature that is sort of co-constituted through humans in the culture, but it's a lens of critiquing that. So I would call this critique the kind of nature that is happening or constructed here. I guess the process that is happening here is a kind of a phytoproductivism. So you're creating this productivism through increased biomass through these plants and increased research that is allowed through these systems. And it's basically a productivism that is very capitalist. So it's a very deeply the capitalist nature culture constellation. That would be my, and then you can say, okay, what are other nature culture constellations? And then juxtaposing that.
Okay, thank you. And another question concerns your first project, which is indeed fascinating in Hawaii. I was wondering if you can say something about. So what I understood from what you presented is there are two basically quite different epistemologies. Is the, say, colonial epistemology with more science in it, and it's the indigenous epistemology, which has also affects and many other things, links with the history, land as mother, maybe very often in many cultures.
Yeah.
So each epistemology proposes several types of technologies. I would be interested in what type of technologies the indigenous epistemology suggests. Let me give you an example. Like I don't know the specific case about Hawaii, but in Latin America, for instance, there is intercropping, which was a sort of technology stemming from local epistemologies, which World Bank thought it's not viable, and they recently started to come back because actually it's quite viable. The same thing with the Sweden cultivation in Southeast Asia. So are there these kind of technologies based on local epistemology which are proposed by locals, and what the other sides think of that? Recently I noticed that there is a sort of coming back to what was 40, 50 years ago considered a sort of backwards, and people who have no idea what they are talking about, and now apparently these technologies of agriculture are actually quite acceptable and obviously more friendly with the environment than the colonial capitalist European type of epistemology.
Yeah, no, thank you. I actually never thought about it this way. I think that, so I have to say that I have not been doing any field work in the last 6 years. So I'm planning to go back this year. And so what I say is really refers to that time back when I was there. One, I think maybe technology is not quite the same, not quite the right term, but like a method or approach, an agricultural approach, is that, so taro, which is the plant that I mentioned, which is in Hawaiian, is called kalo, and it's also actually the elder brother of the human. It's haloa. And this is grown in dryland and in wetland fields. And they have a very sophisticated system where you have actually the wetlands of these taro plants connected to fish ponds. And a circulation of these kinds of nutrients that are then going back into the field. And that I see very much in these aquaponic systems. And that I think is an extremely innovative at the time, for thousands of years has been innovative. The issue is it requires land, and Hawaii is extremely expensive, and it's become, I mean, I talk about this a bit in one article that I published, this idea of paradise that makes Hawaii so inaccessible, even and especially for Kanaka Maoli, for Hawaiians that have to actually move away. They're moving to Texas, they're moving to other places. I think more than half of all Hawaiians that live off the island. They don't live there anymore because you cannot afford it, and they are building condos. So it's an extremely political question when land becomes so expensive. And then vertical farming, a few years ago I saw like, oh, somebody came up with this idea to set up a vertical farming Hawaii. I couldn't believe it. But that it works when you twist and turn certain discourses for your favor. And I think that in general, that would be my thought now, even still, that anything that is sort of considered Hawaiian, local, traditional farming knowledge is just considered a bit backwards and not innovative, because it's not developing any technology or tool that you can patent and sell. So there's always this question of profitability. But there's a lot of very, very active organizations in Hawaii that are increasingly bringing back land through organizations, so non-profit organizations, and there's more and more happening in this direction. So yeah.
Thank you. Well, we don't have questions here anymore in the room. So if there are questions online, please.
Yes, Dragos, you wanted to, because you touched on something that we were discussing also with being called take on education and so on. Yeah, go on.
Yes, my only question is about ethics. I don't know how I put it, but what is the most important ethical issues of this digital agriculture or maybe is a competition between rural and urban agriculture. I don't know. It's so confusing. So many directions which can go. So it's there a cardinal problem? Is there a main issues in this field? Can we do that? Can we start from something fixes something which are the main problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for the question. Maybe I was rushing a bit through this, but I think that digital agriculture, so a lot of scholars in sort of critical agrarian studies and in STS, in an anthropology, they're pointing out how the digitization that is often marketed as making things more efficient, making things more, documenting, the ability to document everything, the ability to share data, to connect people, that this is going to make farming more, like it's going to be more efficient in terms of how pesticides are used, how little or reduced pesticide is needed, and how efficient, basically more efficient, and therefore also more sustainable farming is going to be. And what the proponents of digital agriculture often forget is that they're talking about a very particular kind of farming, and they're talking about making monocultural large-scale farming more efficient, more sustainable. It allows them to use less pesticides because they have drones that are going to detect their weeds, or their precision sprayers, but it doesn't change anything about the agricultural system itself. It's like a path dependency, basically. It's what researchers are saying, that this revolution that is promised is basically just a continuation of the kind of agricultural system that we already know for decades is harmful for the environment. And I think that for the in the last couple of years, these farmer initiatives that are popping up more and more, they are saying like, this digitization is not going to go away, so we should make sure that they are also in our service. So what are actually the tools from the very conception, the design, the development, who is involved in the development, is crucial, because we cannot have yet another technology from outside telling us that now we are sustainable, now we're contributing to biodiversity. And they're saying that it needs to be much more co-created. It needs to be the co-design with the farmers or the farm hackers themselves that are saying, like, no, we're actually developing our own tools from the get-go. We don't need the tech developers. So it's at the end of the day, when asking about the ethics, I think it's a question of power. Always.
Always.
That's too cheap, but it's not just a matter of distributing digital tools to everybody, and then they're like, yeah, you're now more sustainable because you can track what you're doing. It's also who owns the data at the end of the day, and what is happening with the data at the end of the day. So just to give you sort of a much larger picture on this, Monsanto, when it was still Monsanto, was in the early 2010s, it was buying up, I think, over 200 different startups that were collecting climate data. And so over the last 10, 15 years, they have really optimized, and they're moving more and more into the digital realm, because this is where all the knowledge, this is where all the data is collected. And so they're now able to make predictions. Whether they're true or not is another question. But they have so much, like, data is power. And so who owns this data in the future prognosis of farming, especially in agriculture? There's a huge dimension of speculation of the value of land based on this kind of data, and that's where it becomes very tricky. And I think maybe in general, to what many have also pointed out, is that this digitization trend is often very criticized in other domains, but in agriculture is often totally overlooked. And I see this myself too. There's not as much apprehension in the policy realm. And it's just a smaller group of people that are actually like, hey, this is going too far, like we have to have a say here.
Okay, maybe another question. There is a possible a non-human agent agriculture in the future, maybe, and I don't know that about is related to the big data in the new context.
Yeah.
Well, final question for my curiosity. There is some kind of Turing test for artificial food or plants and natural plants or food.
The Turing, sorry, I didn't understand the.
Yes, in a sense that the Turing test, a human or not human intelligence in the future, is there possible to have a food that it is not human makes and it's digitalized and but the taste is so natural that we can make some difference. We can.
So when you say
it's a stupid
no,
question.
I get it. I do want to ask though, when you say non-human made food, is that what you say?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would be my question. Is some technology that is developing that food, do we then say that it's not human? Because we developed the technology to create the food, right? So, and I would probably say no, because we will always be entangled in the kind of food that we are producing. The kind of food that it is, then that's another question. Because I don't necessarily think that the technology, that's often this idea that the technology is sort of like an outside mediator, but it's a very closely entangled relationship that you cannot so easily separate from the environment that we're in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions online or from the room? I'll only ask, sorry for the mentioning of the education, because we discussed the Ingold concept, and I was thinking Dragos was going, because he's also doing a PhD in education science now, and
okay.
we were interested in this. We were reading and discussing. We are both philosophers of science, so interested in such strange topics. How does I mean, you are mentioning that in the educatedness concept. How would Ingold's concept then subsume, or how do you see these different meanings of the educatedness that you?
I think that, yeah. So as far as I remember, I don't think that Tim Ingold actually proposed his own concept. He was just going back to the etymological root of education, educere, and kind of delineating that we have a misconception of education, as that has over time really shaped to be this idea that we're inculcating some knowledge into people's minds, that it's sort of an internal process of digesting information in our minds, and rather that it's a move out to go out. The educere, I think, is sort of this move out. And and so I took inspiration from this very close reading, to say that maybe because for a long time I thought, okay, I'm looking at different forms of education, but it didn't really work because people kept saying, but it's not institutional. So these three different settings, and I was like, okay, I realized that education is too much branded as institutional education, and educatedness, I don't like the term, I have to say, but I couldn't find anything better. But educatedness is this idea, or the process of getting educated, to move away from this institutional idea to say educatedness is a processual, it's a process that anybody can claim nowadays in, you know, the kinds of world that we live in, social media, people, you know, claiming that they know.
Right.
I think you could apply that further, but I have to say that, I mean, there is a chapter that will be published soon talking about this dissertation. I actually never published a monograph, and maybe it could be expanded. But I think that what I was trying to do with this educatedness is to say education is so much wider than just these institutional ideas, and that's what these Hawaiian teachers and activists have known for a long time. They know that a school is without walls. A school is outside in the world, in the aina, in the land, in the ocean. That's where you learn.